Okay, well, it's time to reconvene. My name is Rick Miller. I'm also a member of the committee here. This next panel will be considering the topic of advancing understanding of engineering education pathways, employment dynamics, and economic impact through the innovative use of administrative data. The panelists will be Isabel Cardenas-Navia, founder of Alta Vision Consulting, and Jason Owen-Smith, who's the Barger Leadership Institute Professor of Organizational Studies and Professor of Sociology at the University of Michigan. We'll begin with Isabel, who will speak for 30 minutes, and then she'll be followed by Jason, who will speak for 15, and then we'll have questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. I am going to present a talk that is, I think, will look different to you than the talks you've seen so far, and that is by design. I do workforce and policy in STEM, and we're going to do a little background briefing together, and then we're going to try to do a thought experiment. And I'm hoping that by the end of this presentation, you will see the tremendous potential in the use of administrative data in looking at engineering education pathways, employment dynamics, and economic impact. And so what happens, or every time you do any sort of these activities where you are enrolling in something like high school, when you register to take your SATs, you apply to a university or a program, you accept a job offer at a company, or that you pay your taxes, you create an administrative record. And so I'm going to give you an overview today of, this is my overview of my talk, and it's going to sort of look at administrative data, and then we're going to go through some examples, and then our thought experiment and looking at some recommendations. So we're going to start with the definitions. So administrative data is any data that is collected as in the process of doing some other sort of business. And so it's really collected while you are doing some of the things like registering. A record is created that has some information there. And so really the benefits, there are many benefits to this. And one is the cost of collecting data is already built in. When you register for SATs, for example, you enter your name, your high school, which colleges you want to send your scores to. There's a record created that has these pieces of information that is not related directly to the fact that you're taking a test, but it's collected. So that's the record that's created. And so the cost of collecting this data is already built into whatever administrative procedure or thing that's occurring. And another benefit is that oftentimes this data is updated sort of reliably, regularly, in terms of your taxes, continuously, you pay every year. And if it's, in many times, it's part of a system, so it's collected in a consistent way. You do it at certain times, the same data is collected over and over and over, and so you can also build this record that exists over time. And the cost to assemble and consolidate this data is relatively small compared to other ways of searching for the same data, such as doing surveys. And because of this, administrative data can cover samples and time spans that are really not feasible, easily feasible through other ways. And it provides really data on a broad, every person who takes the SAT or applies to college has an administrative record collected. And so it has individuals who don't normally respond to survey data, and you really get high coverage of the population. And so again, repeated collection of similar sources is not always feasible using other methods. Of course, there are challenges to this, to using administrative data for research purposes. So of course, when you do any sort of data collection, there are significant privacy concerns. This isn't limited to administrative data, so it's not something that's unique to this type of data collection. From the researcher's perspective, you have very limited control over what you're collecting, because you don't get to pick out, you don't get to design what it is they're collecting. It's, the records already exist to those required for administrative purposes from whoever is collecting that data. And so you really have to connect data to be able to answer specific questions. One single sort of set of data will not likely achieve that goal. The data set precision is determined by the lowest quality source of data. And that makes sense. If you have you're linking 4 different data sets and one is very poor, then the overall results of your study are really limited by that collection. And similarly, you're subject to changes in administrative procedures. So when the Census Bureau changes its categories of ethnicity and race, you have to now deal with that challenge that presents to you as you're linking data over time. So there's an upfront investment required when you want to access this data and use it for your research purposes. And so, of course, one of the most significant limitations is that whoever owns that data set has to authorize you to access it, has to provide you, physically provide you access to it, and also, help if there's an investment needed to collect that data, they need to help you along with that as well. So the real value in administrative data, or the greatest value in administrative data, is linking it together across data sets. So the data is used in aggregate, not individually, but you need an individual identifier across the data sets to link a record for one individual, to pull these different information sources together. And this has been done successfully in other fields. So an example you may all be familiar with is STAR metrics, which looks at federal investments, federal grant, research dollar investments, and looks at their economic impact throughout the CIC universities. And so another example, which is also used by a lot of economists, is the modeling income in the near term, which links Social Security Administration information with Census Bureau information, and you look at wages, benefits, and death records and they use this information to predict, how our Social Security benefits might be used or how long they'll last in the future. And so there really had this type of data has been pulled together to be used very effectively by other fields. So now I'm going to talk to you about 2 different examples that I've gotten from David Stevens, who's here, and from the Jacob France Institute, and from Jason Owen-Smith, where I'm going to show you, how this administrative data has been used in engineering, education, and employment. And so the first is work of research from Jason, where you're looking at the impact of research experiences on retention and persistence at University of Michigan. And so the first administrative data set is student record data. So this is transcript data, their major, the demographic information. And this was collected from 2002 to 2014 for about 93,000 students. We're going to combine this with federally funded research records. So this is money that was given to University of Michigan, and are going to look looking again at the same time span, which personnel were funded on these research records. So we have that from the payroll records. And so this is all folks at University of Michigan. They have a University of Michigan identification number, and so that's used to sort of link these two. So when we look at the student record data, there's a research for credit course that students can choose to take. And so 12,000 students in this sort of group we're looking at chose to enroll and complete this research course. We're looking now at the federally funded research records. We see 9,000 students were paid on the grant. And remember, we have their job titles. So we have a general sense of that they're doing research based on this job title. So now, if we can combine this data, we can see that about 20,000 students in total had some sort of undergraduate research experience. 18,000 students had one, and about 2,500 students had both of these. So they took an undergraduate course for credit, and they chose to work in a university laboratory. And so as we have this data now, we have the rest of the student record, and so you can begin then to ask questions as to, is there an impact of this research experience on the student outcomes based on what you know from their record? So that's really looked at the undergraduate experience and retention. And so I'm going to switch gears a little bit to look at the economic impacts that we can look at from student data. And this is data from David Stevens at the Jacob France Institute. And we're going to look at engineering graduate wages from the University System of Maryland. So you looked at two campuses, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and College Park, looking at electrical engineers and mechanical engineers. And we have some data on them we have the social security number, the gender was the only demographic data that was in this run currently included, although I'm sure additional demographics could be included. And it's for all degreed engineers, so we're not breaking out here between bachelor's or master's or PhD. It's all lumped together in this particular data you're going to look at. We're looking at two cohorts from 2005 and 2009. We're also going to look at Maryland unemployment insurance wage records. And for that data, we have the employer, the quarter, their wages, and their partial name. And we're going to look at this over the years of we can pull data from 1985 to 2014. Along with that, Maryland has an agreement with DC, New Jersey, Ohio, and Virginia to take the Social Security numbers and look and see if any match. And if they do, you pull in their wages for each quarter. And so you can now look at a few other states and any wages they might have gotten from those states. Going to also look at Maryland quarterly and quarterly census of employment and wages. And you can look at, the big thing to get here is the industry classification. So we know the employer, generally what industry they're working in, how large they are, and what's their corporate address. So now we get some geographic information built in there, size of the employer, and classification. So generally, what field are these people working in? And we can look also at the federal civilian employee data extracts. So everyone who's a federal employee, your data is available. You can mine it and look at the occupational information, your agency, and your wages. And if we pull this data all together, we can begin to look, in this case, at what your wages are over time. And so on the right, on the left, you're seeing the electrical engineering graduates. On the right, the mechanical engineering graduates. The sample size is about 280 students. This is, again, for fiscal year 2005. You're looking at median and 25th and 75th percentiles here from 2004 to 2013. And so I don't want to delve too deeply into sort of interpreting this data, but I want you to understand that we can trace, how their wages are increasing over time and differences between these two electrical engineers and mechanical engineers. Yes?
Those numbers are so small.
Oh.
All I'm asking her to do is just to read, like, a couple of the median.
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Oh, okay. Oh, is that? So this is, you can see 140,000. This is $94,000 right here. If we start at, let me see, 2005, this is $28,000. If we do similarly for mechanical engineering, it's $24,000, and here at the high end, it's $81,000.
Thank you.
And so, again, this is an example of what has been done right now with the administrative data that has been pulled from these two universities. And so now we're going, so you can imagine, there's a lot of different administrative data that exists that is relevant to the engineering education workforce. So I'm not going to go through each of these. I'm just popping them up here. There's more that I haven't included. But again, the power in administrative data is in linking it. And so if we take these, so now I'm going to start our thought experiment. What is the potential relevance? What kinds of things could we do with administrative data if we linked it? And so if we imagined for a university, college or university system, we wanted to understand what engineering educational migration patterns are occurring. These are some of the questions we could gain insight into. So does high school coursework impact engineering enrollment and persistence? Is there a core set of courses? And again, we can look at relationships with administrative data, which can correlates with persistence. Do demographic factors correlate with enrollment and persistence? When a major is declared, where do students go? Do they successfully graduate? Are certain college courses gateway courses? We know some of this from studies, but we'll really get a large mapping of what's going on at a university. Are certain professors gateway professors? How have engineering migration patterns changed over time? What do the institutional efforts that are made when you do course redesign, when you have a freshman introductory course that you have now added, does it impact engineering migration patterns? How does it impact them? Where are the students going? We look at employment choices. Again, using administrative data, what insights can we gain? So does the coursework that students take impact if they choose to go into engineering does the coursework they take in engineering or in outside courses impact their postgraduate employment? For example, I know in my case, I took a fantastic numerical methods course my senior year in college, and I knew I wanted to do modeling. But is this a general trend? Are there those courses at your university that really impact what students do afterward? How many engineering graduates are employed within 6 months of their graduation? How many as non-engineers? So again, we link this with census data, with employment data, and we can begin to tease this out. Do demographic factors, or which factors will correlate with employment in or outside of engineering after graduation? From a slightly different perspective, when we're thinking about engineering more broadly, do credentials, professional engineering, bachelor's, master's, certificates, do they impact wages after graduation? Is that something that we should be thinking about when we're thinking about offerings to our students, or students should be thinking about when they're thinking about where their career pathways might go? So if we think about engineering employment dynamics now, so how do students move throughout their careers? How can administrative data inform that? So we can look at migration patterns in employment after graduation, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. We can actually follow the pathways of the students as we see if their employers change over time. What are the academic backgrounds of employed engineers? So now we're looking the other way. Let's look at all the category of folks who are engineers, and let's go back in time and take a look at where they're coming from and how their career pathways have moved them into engineering. How do wages compare across engineering majors who work in different sectors in different fields? And again, this is within a single university we're looking at this. So you're really looking at how your students are going out and moving in the world. And what role does continuing education play in the career of employed engineers? Many come back and get another degree. What role does that play as they move throughout their career pathway? Does coming back to get a master's really change their trajectory? When they choose to come back to get a PhD, does that make a difference? And then we can look at the economic impact of engineers with administrative data. And so when I talk about economic impact, I'm talking about where is their footprint, where are they earning their money. So we can look at the zip code of where they work and where they're living. So what is that impact? How does it compare to other graduates? And where is the geography of where that's occurring? If you're a state school and you find out that most of your graduates stay within your region, within your county, that has tremendous implications for how you're getting money from the state and what sort of real amplifying effect that money has in your region and the benefits of that. How many is there a relationship between where you're graduating from and where you're being employed? So how many patent applications? If we're looking at innovation and the added value of that, how many patent applications can be attributed to engineering graduates? How does that compare to other graduates? So those are many of the questions I thought of. I thought of a dozen more since I've been sitting here and then watching from home yesterday. So this is, again, these are sort of thoughts I had about if we could scale this at one college or university or one university system. But what if we took this administrative data, which are already linked within one system, and now we started to think about all the colleges and universities that exist in the US. And we said, is there value if all of them choose to commit to collecting and sharing this administrative data? And what additional questions could we now begin to ask and attempt to answer? So if we scaled the use of administrative data across the universities, colleges, university systems in the US, again, this includes community colleges, what broader things could we bring out? So again, going back K through 12, how does that preparation impact other undergraduate persistence? With the addition of the Common Core standards and the new science standards, does that change as we're adding those, into our national education? Is there a core set of courses, not now within a system, but across the US, which correlates with undergraduate persistence? Are there interventions at the undergraduate level or combinations which correlate with persistence? How does institutional environment impact student persistence? And by institutional environment, I'm talking about, are you at a small liberal arts college? Do you start at community college and you're transferring? Are you at a large urban university? Are you at a land grant university? Are you at 50,000, student public university? How do those environmental factors, we have many now, how can that play a role in student persistence? And do different subpopulations persist differently in different institutional environments? Again, if we scale this and we look at employment dynamics, how does the undergraduate preparation or other credentials impact long-term postgraduate employment? How does it impact wages? Do different subpopulations have different long-term postgraduate differences in employment and wages? So we saw earlier that underrepresented minorities had lower wages or were skewed toward having lower wages. Is that a long-term phenomenon? And how widespread is that? Does geography impact postgraduate employment? So if you're staying local, how does that impact it? How does it impact wages? So we can truly try to begin to compare, what do engineers make in Silicon Valley versus Louisiana? And then how does the institution or program type impact postgraduate employment and wages? You can look at the national, if we look at economic impact, you can look, what is the national impact? So what are the national wages and the impact that engineers have? Where is the geographic footprint of these engineers? Are they concentrated in certain locations? Are they scattered throughout? Where are they working? How do graduates contribute to the creation of new businesses and jobs? And along with that, if you have multiple regions and universities in one area with engineering programs, is there synergy in having that community exist? And is there, what impact does that have on our national economy? And if you're an engineer that's working and you're thinking about going back, what is the economic impact of continuing education and professional development of employed engineers? So having now sort of given you this world of possibility, I'd like to sort of make a couple of recommendations that will hopefully get us closer to achieving those possibilities. So the administrative data can really directly impact the engineering education practice. Faculty and administration will understand how their student success in engineering compares to sister institutions. And they'll really gain a real-time understanding of student migration and retention patterns at their universities and broadly. The interventions, we can use this to successfully identify models in retention and persistence in engineering, hopefully to replicate those, and to determine when or if different subpopulations make different educational and career choices. It'll also impact industry and employers. So they'll be able to understand how employees are moving in and out of their industry and in and out of different employers in their industry. And many of them make these contributions to colleges, to universities, and they'll begin to have a more direct connection between the investment they're making and the outcomes they're seeing in terms of the engineers that are produced and the economic impact they have. So policymakers will begin to understand this is how engineers are contributing to my region, my state, my community. And it'll offer them a tool for sort of advocating for engineering and engineering education and increased investment in that with their peers. And so I have a couple of recommendations that I would recommend, that I would give. So the first is to pilot the use of these administrative data sources to explore these connections between education and workforce dynamics. And so I would support, creating these links at the university system level to understand how those dynamics are working, and then of course the state and regional level, so we can have a broader scope of what's going on. And the second is I would provide incentives for academic institutions to provide access to their administrative data. There's publicly accessible administrative data that exists right now, but institutions need to make a choice to invest in learning from the administrative data that exists within their institution. And so one way that other industries have done that is they've developed an independent clearinghouse which collects and aggregates the data. And part of that is usually the development of an interface which can showcase linked public data sets, in this case ones that are relevant to higher education. So you can look at linking your high school graduation rates with college enrollment and wages. So public data sets. And then in addition to that, for universities and colleges, they can have a sort of private portal that allows them to gain confidential, individualized reports to how their and link their administrative data into the publicly available data. And for researchers who gained access to this to be able to have a wider universe of administrative data to look at. And with that, I will end my presentation.
Thank you very much. Jason?
Thank you all for having me here today. Isabel has teed up my presentation remarkably well. So what I'm going to try to do today, once the presentation is up and running, is give you a flavor of what one very early stage pilot program that we're working on at the University of Michigan might be able to do for the questions you all are asking. I should be very clear. This is early stage work. It's done as a part of two ongoing initiatives. One, a learning analytics project at the University of Michigan that's run by Tim McKay. One, a part of the larger initiative to bring together the STAR metrics data and collate it under a CIC initiative for research use. My target here is not specifically engineers at this point. This is an effort to get a broad gauge look at STEM. There are hints specific to engineering, but we have not yet teased out. So what I'm going to do is show you these things, give you a sense of what the kind of data that Isabel described when linked up can provide, and then talk a bit about the future and turn finally to describing a platform that we are working to build, which I believe has great potential for doing the kind of work that Isabel suggests. So, see, I like to walk around, which means that the webcast. I apologize to everyone out in our not studio audience. Let me begin. I've told you a little bit about the background, right? Learning and research analytics.
Jason, do you want to
Fine. This is part of 2 parallel CIC initiatives. What we discovered were discussions going on at the University of Michigan about big data and how one might use big data for social science and for improving the work of the university, which led a group of us to recognize the possibility of combining these 2 types of data sets, one on research employment out of federal grants, one on the on-campus activities of students, particularly undergrads, but this also includes professional and doctoral students. We're just not talking about them right now. The Sloan Foundation provided some initial funding support to bring together what we call the LARA project, Learning Analytics and Research Analytics, which convened a group of 10 CIC institutions. The CIC is the Big Ten plus the University of Chicago, for those of you who don't know, who brought together representatives from their campus to engage not in data sharing at this point, but in parallel play. What we did was work together to harmonize data structures, to write common code, and then to run parallel analyses on multiple universities' data for the purposes of comparison, right? So this is a first demonstration that these kinds of data can be linked up, that they can be securely maintained. The linkages, as Isabel mentioned, are not personally identifiable. They're hashes on a U of M employee ID, which is given to everybody on campus. And so there are all kinds of ways that we can start to do interesting stuff here. What I'm going to show you is some of the early results from Michigan without giving you any context from any place else or talking about any of the other universities in any detail at all. So you've seen this slide. This is basically what we did. What we did was start with the federally funded grants and the student record data, and we worked our way down to identifying our population of interest, which is the approximately 20,000 students who are enrolled undergraduates on the University of Michigan campus who had a research experience, either a 4-credit course as a part of our undergraduate research opportunities program or paid employment on a federal research grant. Those students break out in about this way. Right? You can start to see some demographic differences. I won't belabor it a lot. Women, slightly more than men in the employment. I'm going to talk much more about the employment than the courses today, just for time. You can see things like Pell Grant status gives us a sense of, sort of need. We have an indicator of first generation status that we're working on. There are a bunch of different ways that one can tease out these data demographically. You can ask who funds them. And so these are the agencies that funded the grants, that paid the students. I feel a bit like my children's Dr. Seuss books. But the agencies that funded the grants, that paid the students, that took the classes, that got the jobs. I'll stop. Because we're doing all of STEM, what you can see is that the National Institutes of Health at a university with a very big medical center dominates in terms of numbers, but many, many, many engineering students are paid under the National Science Foundation, DoD, and DOE grants. Right? And this is sort of where these things happen. There are also a bunch paid under NIH grants. We have a strong biomedical engineering program. We haven't started to tease out all of these things yet, but beginning to ask who is paying and beginning to think about what the topics of the grants are. We know the grant numbers. We have the abstracts of the grants. We can begin to ask questions about what kinds of research students are participating in. We can also ask what kinds of jobs they do. So undergraduates occupy a whole lot of job categories. There is massive work. One of the challenges of linking these administrative data, as Isabel suggested, is harmonizing occupational categories across a number of institutions so that we know that a graduate student is a graduate student is a graduate student, That's difficult. We're beginning that work. Data linkage helps. We want to try to create a system where if we're going to sync that work into a system, we do it once. Once, professionally, nicely documented, protected. That's going to be a theme you hear from me, that the benefits of scale are going to be realized primarily if we can consolidate and do a little bit of centralization. Anyway, this gives us a sense of where these students are. About 30% are in what's the assistant and research category, 29% in laboratory assistants, about 11% are a specific class of research assistant for the social sciences, and then about 10% show up as tutors, right? These are people who are paid, we think, to be part of a variety of research classes. We can begin to get, between the grants and the job categories, a sense of what the jobs the students are actually doing are. We can see the degree programs, and this is where you start to get a hint of engineering. So these are the colleges at the University of Michigan. Engineering proportionally is out in the lead right now. About 18% of all enrolled, actually these are graduates because we only know what college you're in when we see you graduate. So about 18% of all graduates in this time period from the engineering school were at one point or another in their career paid on a research grant. That's actually, I thought, a pretty nice number. If you'd asked me, guess how many students are employed on federal research grants as a part of their undergraduate trajectory, I probably wouldn't have guessed 18. Right? I probably wouldn't have guessed 12.6 either. Right? And so there are interesting questions about what this is, what it does, what it means, but we can start to see it. If you put these two together, you can get a sense of the research careers. So these are just the numbers again. 12,000 took this class, 9,100 paid on a grant, about 2,400 did both things. 87% of the people who did both things took the class first and then deepened their experience by going on and being paid on a grant. Right? We can begin to ask questions in interesting ways about trajectories, and for the first time by combining some of these data, we can ask questions about trajectories that include both curricular and co-curricular activities. Most of the kinds of research employment, at least when I hire undergraduates on my grants, they don't also get credit when they're being paid as a job, right? This is something else. This is a job. And so what you can see here is basically just a histogram that by CFDA, the blue are, these are all employees. The blue are people who took the research class before being employed. The red are people who took the research class after being employed. And the green are people who were employed but never took the research class. Just as a beginning, you can start to tease out some of the directions. You can also ask yourself, what does this do? Right? So if we take those groups and we break them up and we ask, so this is two cohorts, 2007 and 2008 entering cohorts for the whole university. It's not just engineering. Right? What we see is the blue is the overall 5-year graduation rate. About 87% of people graduate in 5 years, which is actually really good relative to the national average. It's a number we could improve, but we like. We can see what majors they are. We use SIP codes from the NSF to distinguish between STEM and non-STEM majors. And what we see is on average, for everybody, about 46% of STEM majors graduate in 5 years, about 53%, 54% of non-STEM majors. If we look at those who are research employed, first, the overall 5-year graduation rate jumps. Right? So this is not surprising because the kinds of students who get hired on research grants by faculty are probably stronger, more dedicated students who are seeking out opportunities. So it's not surprising they graduate more frequently. But we could start to tease out some of the causes. And we could begin to ask, what's really interesting for me is the reversal at all these levels in STEM and non-STEM. Right? So a whole lot higher rate of STEM graduation over 5 years for students who are involved in these research trajectories. Asking questions about how these kinds of co-curricular experiences fit into a pathway through a campus, mesh with, complement, or add to curricular experiences, and maybe aid in persistence could be important. We also, these aren't the best numbers. This is just overall cumulative GPA by the category. This isn't in major or in particular classes. But the idea is that you can see majors, activities, academic outcomes, rates of persistence. These are all really interesting things for getting at the components of education that go into the workforce. So we stop there, but there are things you can do with the additional kinds of linkages that Isabel's talking about, and I'll tell you about them in a second, where you take these data and link to sources that show you what happens off campus. And you can begin to ask, what does a research experience of various sorts, what kind of research trajectory leads students to what kinds of jobs? How do these things affect rates of pay, movement geographically, movement into different industries? All of these sorts of issues, could be addressed. Oh, two other quick things. I put these up just so you get a sense. This is a quick box plot for students who never had any research experience that we can see, neither of these two. The size here is just proportional to the number of students. The small number is the major. These are graduates. The University of Michigan is broken down into the arts and sciences, where most students are. So this is the social science division, the humanities division, the natural science division, all the other colleges, because the person who made this is a physicist. Sort of get collapsed into other. Color here, the darker toward red you get, the worse the GPA. The further toward blue, the better. These are, this gives you a sense of who's doing this. These are the people who are employed on research grants. Right? What you see immediately is a much larger proportion of the folks in the natural sciences. You see a bunch of engineering majors. Here's electrical and computer, here's mechanical, here's chemical, biomedical, this is industrial operations, this is aerospace. You sort of begin to get a sense of where these folks fall and of how you might think about, potentially, if you have enough students, comparisons across groups. So how is electrical engineering, computer science different than a physics and computer science degree in the arts and sciences context? One of the other interesting things is that a lot of non-STEM majors are paid on these grants as well. Right? And so the conversation I heard earlier about how one might understand a liberal arts or a humanitarian interpretation of an engineering education, there might actually be natural experiments in rich data that could let you start to tease that out. So, next steps. Data sharing. We need infrastructure to be able to do it if we want to be able to do it once and do it well. We need data linkages. What is lacking right now, at least from my perspective, is a kind of integrated interdisciplinary research community that's working to develop the kinds of validated models and findings out of these data that are necessary both to inform policymaking at the organizational level and at the larger level. This can only be done with serious stakeholder input, particularly from the universities and schools, but also from funders and employers. What I think we're aiming toward here is a sort of use-inspired fundamental research about the engineering, education, and workforce, for myself, really about the public value of higher education, period, full stop, of which engineering is an important part. So how do we do that? I want to show you a couple of slides about something that we are working on now, and I say I have 5 minutes, with significant support from the CIC and the Sloan and the Kauffman Foundations, a group of us, including Julia Lane, Bruce Weinberg, Rebecca Rosen, Barbara McFadden-Allen, James Evans, Ron Jarman. The list goes on. This is a cast of very talented team of lots of people working on this. We're beginning to build something that we call the Institute for Research on Innovation in Science. I won't belabor the STAR metrics portion of this, but this is the basic operational structure. The center here, this is what we call the core, in the sense of an NIH core facility. It's housed right now at the University of Michigan, and the idea is that universities send their administrative data to the University of Michigan under an MOU that we're defining right now and working through the VPRs with. Part of this is getting the incentives right and the data sharing. Individual data sits in a campus-specific box. We use it to develop reports and dashboards that get sent back that can be used by the institutions for their own intelligence and planning. No institution sees any other institution's individual data. Right? We take that and combine and clean it, do the work of things like harmonizing the occupational categories. Turns out that if you want to work with learning data, harmonizing course names so that the initial engineering or physics sequence on multiple campuses are actually comparable, that takes a whole lot of local expertise in the form of professors and registrars and advisors and others. It's work we only want to do once, right? It's work we want to do collectively, we want to document, we want to do once. That combined data will be pushed once a year to the US Census, where it can be linked under very strict federal confidentiality requirements under Title 13 and Title 26 to the kinds of data that allow us to see in the aggregate career trajectories, wages, things like that. And this is sort of the promise, the national promise of the kind of work that Isabel is describing. And the idea is that that will be available to the research community through the Census Research Data Center. program, which is out there to do it. We will then, in Iris, de-identify the data and build a set of disclosure proofing rules. This is what we're working on with our various stakeholders right now, which make these data available through a virtual data enclave to other researchers. The way this will be built is by bringing in different, what we call nodes, organizations that are working extensively with the data, with expertise in particular areas, with the idea that they will be improving the data set continuously, and that this is how we become responsive to the research community. This is a model that's happening on the research side. We have already sharing some data, a list of universities. These are some of the institutions that were involved in the parallel play with the learning data. They are not sharing data. I cannot talk about any of their findings. I describe them only because they all participated in a public meeting. Right? These are institutions that are in the process of having some data linked into the census. Right? This is beginning to develop. It's beginning to build up steam. And I believe that if we are mindful and think about the kinds of questions in stakeholder communities that need to be addressed here as we do it, they're really rich questions for this panel, and indeed I think for the higher education sector that can be addressed. So I think about how we understand in engineering or in higher education generally rich educational experiences in and outside the classroom. There's an experiment we're working with on our campus where we're enticing students to scan the student IDs of people who participate in their student group activities, right? So we can see co-curricular activities and ask how that happens. We can, in principle, at least for internships that were taken for credit, get information on internships that were taken. This can allow us to start to answer these questions. Already, the hints about what we can say about matriculation and persistence rates are very strong. Thank you. Their connections to further education and careers have been some beginning discussions, as I mentioned. The census is a partner in this. Ron Jarman, who is a co-PI on the grants, is a part of this. There's some discussion about the possibility of linking into clearinghouse data. That's a few steps down the road, but it's another data source that lets us see, for instance, movement into graduate education. They're the possibilities of rich comparisons. Engineers in different institutional settings to each other, engineers to non-engineers, engineers across cohorts. You begin to get a sense. And what's potentially very, very interesting are the possibility of really structuring real evaluations of interventions that might be designed. Thank you.
At this point, we would like to open it for questions from the audience.
This is Eric Ducharme, GE Aviation. Just a question on what data privacy issues might be a factor in terms of being able to link some of these records, and could you talk a little bit about that?
The privacy and confidentiality issues are serious and important. There are a number of them. Right? First of all, in order to be able to link these data, some degree of personally identifiable information is necessary. Right? You can use, at the simplest level, the names of individuals can be used. More data allows for more effective linkages. Part of what we are working very hard to do right now in consultation with relevant privacy officers, with the offices of general counsel at a variety of universities, is to structure memoranda of understanding and data use agreements that make it very clear where the line between working with these identifiable data for the purposes of linkage and de-identified data that are protected and disclosure proofed for the purposes of research falls. So there's a significant issue. The work that is being done around privacy and confidentiality for this kind of large-scale analytic data is moving. There are folks in the room who know more than I about the state of the art of privacy here, but this is an open and ongoing discussion among many parts of the research community. We believe we can get it right, but a huge part of getting it right requires having a stable institutional source that can be a good faith broker, with sort of all the parties involved. We think that's very important. That's part of how we're trying to design from the ground up this initiative.
Julia Lane, your colleague. So I wanted to respond to the privacy and confidentiality thing and then just point out one additional piece. The privacy and confidentiality, certainly with the links to the Census Bureau, I think what Jason pointed out is the issues are serious and need to be addressed carefully and professionally. So that's the important value of having a standing institute that takes care of that. I should note with the Census Bureau links, the data linkage is covered under Title 13 and Title 26 of the US Code. So there's $750,000 fine and or 10 years in jail if an individual is re-identified. And names don't float around the Census Bureau. They as soon as they come in, they're replaced by a protected identification key. And so it's for statistical purposes only. So essentially the identifiable information vanishes a nanosecond after it hits. So that's a very important point to make. I wanted to make one other point, which one of the things that surprised me about the conversations over the past day and a half is the almost complete focus on the earnings and employment trajectories of engineers. And I think that is an important point. But in our analysis of the matches to the Census Bureau of the Caltech data, Jean-Loup, and of Purdue data, for example, it's been remarkable the number of startups that are showing up in the data associated, yes, indeed, with faculty, but also with graduate students, postdocs, and undergraduates. And those data are really only available from the Census Bureau matches, looking at not just the startups, but the subsequent employment growth and productivity of the firms for which they work. So the effect of training is split in two parts, right? One is the returns to the individuals, and the second is the returns to the firms. And so you can only capture that by studying the trajectories of firms, both the employing firms and the startups. So I don't want to lose sight of that.
I want to go back to Nadja Fuad, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. That slide with the trajectory of the salaries is striking to me, given, again, what we've said all about pay and promotion. There's something that happened, apparently, in 04, 05, that was a huge jump in median salaries. I don't know, Jason, if you can pull that up. No, it can't just be accounted for by the economy. The interesting thing is, I don't know if anybody in here can talk about what actually happened contextually, but given the importance of 4 years of math in high school, something happened in those kids' high school careers that led them to realize that amount of pay, and then the relative lack of that jump, or relative stability of median pay, there it is. Something happened in 05, between 05 and 06, or 04 and 06, and then that relative stability of that. And I'm wondering, I don't know if anybody in here who's an engineer can help explain that. Thank you.
So actually, David Stevens is here, and if he wants to speak to the data, this data.
Yeah. First of all, the jump in 05 that's when they graduated. This is an 05 cohort. So
Oh, this is that cohort, it's not the median.
that's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this includes both baccalaureate, master's, and PhD. We've broken it out, but this particular slide includes all degree levels. And one of the things we know about the difference between electrical and mechanical is gender issues between those two degrees. So there's a lot we know behind what's included in these particular two graphs.
Daniel Keene from the Urban Institute. So administrative data are good for answering a lot of questions, but one concern I've always had for these career pathways, occupational pathways, research questions is that most of these sources don't have occupation data in them. They might have industry of the firm reporting the wage records, but with a few exceptions. You mentioned the federal employee database. I think Washington State's wage records have occupations, but otherwise, I don't think you have them. So I guess my question is, are those fears well-founded, or is there a source for the occupational information? And how would you look into one of these career pathway research questions?
So no source of data is perfect. We do not have, in many of these records, very, very detailed occupational classifications, but what we do have are movements of individuals which in the aggregate let us see trajectories across wage levels, across industries, across sectors. Those together with, for instance, in the academic world, ages, right, times since graduations allow us to understand, again, in statistical terms, the various trajectories through different stages of the career ladder. I think what's interesting in this instance for me is less trying to understand, the internal labor market of a particular firm than it is trying to understand how the movements of people across organizations over their careers tie together industries and sectors and facilitate the creation of things like regional high-tech economies and clusters. So you are correct that there are some levels of detail which can't be reachable by this. I would never argue that one should stay only with existing administrative data. I also believe that as this effort goes and expands, the quality of data and the variables that will be available will develop. One of the things that, for instance, the shared university data do is allow us for the first time to really begin to see what a career trajectory through an actual job structure is. It's possible to go to websites and figure out what the job description of a research assistant in social science is, as opposed to the job description of a laboratory assistant temp. There's a lot of work there, but every investment in the quality of the data adds the possibility of new linkages. Every additional stakeholder adds the possibility of new work. So the fact that we're not there yet, I think, doesn't preclude getting there. It is important to recognize that there are places we are not yet, and that it will take a concerted effort of a research community and a community of stakeholders to build the infrastructure to let us get there.
I'm Donna Ginther from the University of Kansas. I've been involved, at least in Kansas and Missouri, in similar efforts to match school district data to the clearinghouse and then to the labor market, and match Board of Regents data to the unemployment wage records. And what I've found, and I'd like the panel to speak to these issues, is that you can do these matches and you can get really interesting analyses, and then the state governments lock it down. And we tried to use our match data from the Board of Regents for a research project, and they said absolutely not. And we're getting a lot of pushback, at least in the center of our country, to do a little bit, but never push the data in for research purposes. So do you have, holistically speaking, is there a way to sort of talk to the federal government and the state governments about the value of doing this? I'm sold on the value, but my ability to do it has been proscribed.
So I think this is where the idea of having a centralized clearinghouse would be very helpful, because then you're not the only one alone sort of fighting this battle with your state representatives and local government. If it's part of sort of everyone in your state doing this, then I think that it really becomes one way that you can inform these decisions. And I think that's really the power of doing this broadly, because it sounds like it is a very difficult battle to fight this on your own.
Well, I mean, isn't it true when you're matching to the LEHD, you have to get the approval of every single state in order to match to their records? I mean, I know we talked to Census Bureau people last week, and they said they're trying to work through that, but it's the details of being able to access these data are huge.
Yes, they are. And again, there are others in the room who I'm certain know more than I. My, perhaps naive, I don't think so, but perhaps, sense is that the challenge here lessens as greater cooperation occurs, right? The challenge in the work that I am working with is that it feels dangerous for a single institution, right, or a single state to be out in front. A group of states or a group of institutions who are promised some individual confidentiality in return for relinquishing control over aggregate uses of their data, right? I think that's the strategy to go. In terms of access to various data sources, I actually am not unhappy that getting access to these restricted census data is difficult. To be perfectly honest, as a citizen, as a person who is in those data, I am more comfortable knowing that the hurdles for researchers enforce upon them a realization of the gravity of trust that goes into working with these kinds of confidential data. And I believe that rather than necessarily saying we shouldn't try this because of the difficulties, I think we should treat the difficulties as one way to think about the privacy, the confidentiality issues, and building a responsible research community. We may not, in the near term, get all that we want. I think if we do our work well, if we interact well with stakeholders, if we demonstrate the value of what we're doing, if we are careful and professional and mindful, I think it will happen. But, you know, all credit to you. I've been struggling in some of these fields for a few years now. I recognize the difficulties. I am not certain they are not a feature rather than a bug.
We're running a little bit long, so maybe just one more question.
Sure. Hi, David Knight, Virginia Tech. I have a question about the U of M project on when you get down to the course level experiences or co-curricular experiences, can you talk about the conversations that you may have had about letting students or faculty for that matter opt in to the program?
Well, at this stage, under the initial learning analytics transcript, this is not an opt-in process, right? For the co-curricular, right, the idea there is that this actually is. The way we are approaching that, and we think it may be a model, it's still very, very early stages, so I don't know if it'll work, is that students are an important stakeholder group. And our students at the University of Michigan in particular are very anxious to have the ways that they do work outside the classroom recognized, right? And so there is a push, probably on many of your campuses, for micro-credentialing, for badging, for things like that. One way to work toward an opt-in with the students is to explain to them that helping us to get the data that grounds the value of their experiences and that will allow us to actually characterize them is an important step. Right? And so this again is part of the ongoing process. It's part of why this is a slow process at this point, because we are working through a variety of issues. But I think I am consistently surprised by the willingness when we bring to various groups initial findings. The general reaction is, oh my, how interesting, or maybe at worst, how do we improve this? I think there's an immense amount, and this room is probably evidence of it, of good faith and engagement. And I think it improves our credibility if we say, here's something we found that we may not completely understand or that we might like to see changed. Let's think about how we move from here.
I want to thank the panel for a very interesting and enlightening presentation.